It began, as most strange stories do, in the silence between two wars. In 2010, deep in the highlands of eastern Afghanistan, a platoon of U.S. soldiers stationed near Kunar province started reporting something that would never appear in any official military record, something that moved like smoke, that shifted through the night air, and that left behind only silence and fear. The place was remote. A forward operating base pressed against the ridges that cut the sky apart like jagged bones. The soldiers called it Outpost Razor, a lonely fortress surrounded by mountains where the wind never stopped whispering. Every night after the radios went quiet and the valley fell into that haunted stillness only war zones know, the men said the same thing. There was something out there, watching them. At first, no one paid attention. Soldiers in combat zones hear and see things. The desert plays tricks on the mind. The heat, the exhaustion, the adrenaline, they all blur together into hallucinations. But this was different. They all described it the same way. A shape that had no form. Sometimes it looked like a shadow crawling along the ridge. Other times like a column of mist rising from the ground. Almost human, but never still. They said it could move against the wind, that it bent the light around it. When it appeared, the radios would go dead. The night vision would static out, and the silence would deepen, the kind that presses on your chest heavy and suffocating. The first report came from Sergeant Daniel Hayes, a 26-year-old from Kentucky, serving his second deployment. One night, while on watch at Tower 3, he noticed something moving along the rocks below. He thought it was an insurgent, until his infrared scope picked it up as a cold void, a complete absence of heat. He watched it rise and dissipate, reforming seconds later closer to the base. He called it in. The QRF team swept the area, found nothing but a faint, acrid smell, like burned rubber and dust. Over the next week, similar reports started to pour in. Soldiers on patrol heard footsteps behind them in the sand. Shadows moved along ridgelines with no source of light. One man claimed he saw a figure standing inside the fog, like a man made of smoke, he told his commanding officer. It looked right at me, but there were no eyes. The higher-ups dismissed it as combat stress, but things escalated. During one night patrol, an MRAP vehicle stalled for no reason on a clear road. The electronics failed all at once. When the soldiers stepped out to check the engine, one of them started screaming. He said something had passed right through him, cold like ice under the skin. They brought him back to base trembling, incoherent, refusing to leave his bunk for 3 days. The interpreter assigned to the unit, a local man named Farid, had his own explanation. He called it Dahman, a word that roughly translates to the dust that walks. In Afghan folklore, it is said to be a spirit born from war and blood, a shadow that feeds on trauma. According to him, when too many men die in one place, the ground becomes poisoned by memory. The Dahman emerges from that corruption, shaped by pain and fear. The soldiers laughed it off, but not for long. In late November, the platoon received orders to clear a small village at the base of the ridge, an area rumored to harbor Taliban fighters. The operation began before dawn. Fog rolled in unnaturally thick that morning, swallowing their vision, muffling their footsteps. Halfway through the sweep, radio contact dropped. The lead squad went silent. When they were finally found, 20 minutes later, they were sitting in the middle of the road, weapons down, staring blankly into the mist. Their expressions were hollow, eyes dilated. None could recall what happened. One private whispered a single word before passing out: smoke. When footage from their helmet cams was reviewed, most files were corrupted. Static, noise, nothing but flashes. But one clip, just 2 seconds long, survived. In it, a figure appears for a fraction of a moment, thin, black, and rippling like vapor. Then the image cuts to white. After that incident, morale plummeted. Soldiers began refusing night guard. One man shot at his own reflection in a vehicle mirror, claiming he saw it standing behind him. The commanding officer requested psychological evaluation for the unit. Within weeks, several men were reassigned. Outpost Razor was abandoned the following year, yet the story didn't die there. In 2015, a contractor who revisited the site to dismantle equipment reported strange readings on his instruments, spikes in electromagnetic fields. Even though all power sources had been disconnected, local villagers refused to approach the area, saying it was touched by smoke. Some skeptics say it was a collective hallucination triggered by stress and isolation. Others suggest it was an atmospheric anomaly, low-lying fog interacting with infrared optics. But a few researchers in anomalous psychology point to a deeper pattern. Sightings of similar entities near conflict zones, from Vietnam to Iraq, always described the same way, like smoke that moves. Dr. Thomas Bell, a military psychiatrist, later analyzed the soldiers' testimonies in an unpublished paper. He noted a disturbing commonality. Those who claimed to see the smoke also reported intense guilt or trauma from combat. Bell theorized the apparition was not external but psychological, a shared manifestation of the human mind breaking under pressure. Still, that theory doesn't explain the camera footage, or the failed electronics, or the smell. Years later, one of the soldiers, now retired, shared his account anonymously. His voice in the recording trembles. "We saw it more than once. I know what fog looks like. I know what heat shimmer looks like. This thing was alive. It moved like it had purpose, and it was watching us. You could feel it. The air went heavy, your heart slowed down, like something was pulling the life right out of you." He paused for several seconds before finishing, barely above a whisper, and when it left, it took something with it. Some believe the creature, if that's what it was, represents more than superstition. They see it as a reflection of the battlefield itself, a living embodiment of the trauma left behind by generations of war. A ghost not of a person, but of violence. The smoke is memory made real, feeding on fear, shaped by death. To this day, the U.S. military has never confirmed or denied the incident. The reports remain buried in classified archives, but among those who served in that part of Afghanistan, whispers persist. They say, when the nights grow cold and the valleys fill with fog, you can still see it drifting through the ruins of Outpost Razor. Silent, formless waiting. The soldiers called it the smoke that remembers, and perhaps that's exactly what it was. The story might have ended there, sealed away in forgotten after-action reports, dismissed as superstition, if not for what happened 8 years later. In 2018, a NATO logistics team was dispatched to the same region, tasked with clearing remaining infrastructure from the drawdown years. The operation was routine, quiet. But as the convoy reached the old coordinates of Outpost Razor, the radios began to crackle, not with interference, but with a voice. Faint, garbled, repeating the same call sign from 2010. Echo 2-1, on station. The transmission repeated 3 times before cutting off. That call sign belonged to a soldier who had died during the withdrawal. The team dismissed it as a glitch, maybe old encrypted chatter bouncing off the mountains. But when they reached the ridge, they found the base still standing, out barely. The HESCO barriers had collapsed into the dust. The guard towers sagged under the wind. Yet amid the decay, the place felt untouched, preserved somehow, like time had slowed around it. Sergeant Mason, a radio operator on that 2018 mission, later told Military Review that the silence there was not natural. He said even the insects refused to make noise. And when the dust kicked up, it didn't move like dust. It hung in the air, thick, sluggish, heavy. It moved like something that wanted to take shape, he said. They only stayed 20 minutes. Then the interpreter, an old man from Asadabad, began to whisper a prayer under his breath. The dead do not sleep here, he said. They walk. After the team returned to Bagram, 2 of the soldiers developed severe respiratory illness. Doctors called it environmental exposure, fungal dust maybe. But the men described it differently. It felt like breathing smoke that didn't belong to fire. What makes this story so persistent, so chilling, isn't just the mystery. It's the pattern. Across Afghanistan and provinces scarred by years of fighting, soldiers reported similar phenomena. In Ghazni, a night watch recorded shapes flickering through thermal optics. In Helmand, drone footage showed a dark mass rising from a burned-out compound, dissipating seconds later. None of it made it into official briefings. But among those who served, it became part of the war's mythology. Some called it the Shimmer, others, the Dust Ghost. But in Kunar, it always had the same name, the Smoke. To understand why this story carries such weight, we have to step outside the realm of soldiers and into the deeper history of the land itself. The Kunar Valley has seen continuous warfare for centuries, from Alexander's army to the British Raj, from the Soviet invasion to modern-day conflicts. Each generation spilled blood on the same soil, buried the same dead, built new forts atop the ruins of the old. Local Sufi mystics once said that when the land absorbs too much violence, it begins to breathe, exhaling the grief of the fallen. The smoke was not a demon or ghost, but the land's sorrow made visible. In Pashto poetry, it was called Hubarijan, the dust of souls. This belief runs deep across Central Asia. Legends speak of battlefield spirits that take the form of vapor or sand, drifting through valleys long after the fighting ends. The Mongols called them Kökçün, the blue wind. In Persian folklore, they were Saya-e-Kak, the shadow of dust, always formless, always moving. So, when U.S. soldiers, young men raised on rational science and night vision tech, encountered something that didn't obey physics, it was as if the ancient and modern worlds collided. A myth reborn through infrared lenses. But myths alone don't explain the evidence. In 2019, a researcher named Dr. Elena Markov, specializing in battlefield psychology, obtained limited access to sensor data from Outpost Razor. She discovered something curious: electromagnetic spikes coinciding with each reported sighting. Not random interference, but consistent bursts, as if a pulse of energy was being emitted or absorbed by something unseen. She published a paper proposing a controversial hypothesis: that extreme human emotion, under sustained stress, might imprint itself onto the environment. That trauma could, in rare cases, manifest physically, what she called residual psychogenic phenomena. In short, the smoke wasn't a ghost, but an echo of memory, burned into the air by violence. Markov's work drew ridicule from mainstream scientists, but it struck a chord with veterans. Hundreds wrote to her, describing experiences from Iraq, Bosnia, even Somalia, all eerily similar. One Marine wrote, "We thought it was heat shimmer, but when it moved toward us, the temperature dropped 15 degrees, and all we could smell was burnt metal." Markov concluded her paper with a haunting line: "Perhaps we have misunderstood the nature of ghosts. They may not be the dead at all, but the living, trying to forget." The final chapter of the Outpost Razor mystery came not from science, but from one man's confession. In 2021, an unnamed intelligence analyst leaked portions of an internal U.S. Army report, codenamed Echo Phenomena Log 49. It contained transcripts from intercepted radio chatter, equipment malfunctions, and psychological assessments. One line stood out: multiple units report sightings consistent with unknown atmospheric entity, non-human, non-thermal, no identifiable biological mass. The report classified the entity as Type 7 anomalous visual occurrence. Recommended response: observe only. Do not engage. The leak was quietly buried within days, but the document's authenticity has never been disproven. Even now, when veterans of Kunar gather, the subject sometimes surfaces after midnight, when the drinks run deep and the room grows quiet. Someone will mention the smoke, the others will fall silent. One by one they'll nod, not in belief but in recognition, because whatever that thing was, it wasn't just out there in the mountains. It was in them, in the memories they carried home, In the dreams that wake them at 3 a.m., gasping, the smell of burned air still lingering. Maybe the creature was real, a phenomenon science hasn't yet named. Or maybe it was the embodiment of guilt, the shape of all that unspoken sorrow that follows men who've seen too much. But one thing remains certain. In the valleys of Afghanistan, when the fog rises and the radio falls silent, the past still walks, slow, silent, and watching. The soldiers called it the smoke that moves against the wind, and somewhere, even now, it's still drifting through the ruins, carrying their stories like ash in the air. The legend of the smoke that moves did not fade with the withdrawal of troops. Instead, it began to ripple quietly across the networks of veterans groups, encrypted forums, and long-forgotten message boards. It lived not as a campfire tale, but as a shared riddle, something unspoken that every soldier who'd spent nights in those valleys seemed to understand without explanation. In early 2022, a retired U.S. Army combat engineer named Robert Klein uploaded a grainy video to a private veterans forum. It showed the crumbling remains of Outpost Razor. He'd returned to Afghanistan as a civilian contractor, helping with humanitarian infrastructure work. His voice trembled as he narrated, the camera shaking as he climbed over collapsed barriers and rusted concertina wire. Then, the lens caught something in the corner. A distortion, like a shimmer of heat, except the temperature that day was below freezing. The image flickered. Behind the blur, the mountains bent slightly out of shape, as if gravity itself were folding. He froze, whispered, "Jesus Christ, it's real." Then the feed cut out. The clip spread quietly through dark corners of the internet. Veteran chat rooms, fringe archives, encrypted drives. Analysts slowed it down frame by frame. What they found was inconclusive. A ripple in the pixels, a shadow shaped like a man, or perhaps the illusion of motion created by lens flare. But in the slowed audio, there was something else, a sound almost like breathing, deep, rhythmic, faint. Robert Klein never posted again. 3 months later, his family reported he'd passed away from a sudden cardiac arrest. He was 41 years old. It's tempting to dismiss these accounts as folklore born of trauma. War changes the human brain. It reshapes memory, perception, emotion, and yet there's something uncanny about how the same details appear again and again. Across different wars, different decades, different continents. In 2003, British soldiers stationed outside Basra, Iraq, described a black vapor that moved independently of wind. In 1969, American troops in Vietnam's Ashau Valley reported seeing a ghostly mist following their patrol for days. And during the Soviet-Afghan War, veterans of the 40th Army spoke of dik dushi, the breath of souls, that emerged from the caves after bombardments. Every culture gives it a name. Every soldier, a story. Perhaps it is the same phenomenon, the world's unhealed wound manifesting again and again where men kill each other in the name of flags. In late 2023, a group of documentary filmmakers and former journalists embedded in Afghanistan during the surge years attempted to retrace the events around Outpost Razor. They called their project Smoke, Memory. The film was never officially released, but leaked rough cuts surfaced months later. In one interview, a local shepherd, an old man who had lived his entire life in the shadow of the ridge, described what he'd seen. Through a translator, he said, "Before the Americans came, we saw it during the Soviet War. Before them, our fathers saw it when the British fought here. It is not their ghost. It is war itself. It never leaves." He pointed to the valley below. "When men die in fear, the land breathes them out again." His words lingered like prophecy. The film crew left a thermal camera running overnight at the ruins of the outpost. The next morning, the battery was drained. But for exactly 13 seconds before the feed cut, something appeared. Not visible light, but heatless motion, a silhouette colder than the surrounding air. The sound engineer later described hearing a low, human-like hum, as if hundreds of voices were whispering at once, too soft to separate into words. The footage, analyzed by experts at multiple universities, showed no signs of tampering. The anomaly remains unexplained. There is a strange pattern in how these stories end, not with horror but with silence. Those who witness the smoke seldom scream, flee, or fight. They fall still, their hearts slow. They feel a pull, as if their own breath is being drawn into something vast and unseen. Psychologists studying combat trauma note that soldiers often describe death not as violence, but as quiet, a stillness that swallows sound and color. In that sense, the smoke might not be an external force at all, but the physical expression of that silence, the point where memory and oblivion blur. If so, then the creature that haunted Outpost Razor was not there to harm, but to remember. In 2024, a classified DARPA project surfaced briefly in defense budget documents under the name Echo Resilience Study. Buried deep in the report was a single chilling line. Objective: assess potential interaction between trauma-induced environmental resonance and cognitive field effects in long-term combat zones. To the untrained eye, it was meaningless bureaucratic jargon, but to those who knew the stories, it sounded like something else. An admission that the military had started to take the smoke seriously. Nothing more about that project was ever made public. Tonight, if you stand in the Kunar Highlands, the air still hums faintly. The wind whistles through rusted towers, stirring ash and dust into spirals that fade as soon as they form. Locals still avoid the ruins. Sometimes, shepherds say they hear American voices echoing faintly, laughing, talking, calling for water, though no one has lived there in over a decade. And when the fog comes down the valley, rolling like a living thing, it moves not with the wind, but against it. Just like before, perhaps it is only air and dust shaped by fear and memory. Or perhaps it is the lingering breath of war, the echo of every soldier who ever walked those mountains whispering into the dark. The soldiers called it the smoke that remembers. The locals call it the breath of the dead. But the truth is simpler and far more tragic. It is what remains when men bring death to a place for too long. The memory of the world trying to breathe again. Dawn in the mountains of Kunar is unlike dawn anywhere else on Earth. The air is thin, metallic, trembling with the weight of all it has witnessed. The sun doesn't rise. It bleeds through the mist, slowly revealing the scars left behind. Burnt trees, twisted shrapnel, the skeleton of an outpost that once guarded nothing but ghosts. This is where the story comes full circle. Not in battle, not in chaos, but in silence. Years after the last American patrol vanished from those ridgelines, the land still whispers. Locals say that in the quiet hours before morning, when the world turns blue, a strange fog rises from the ground. It doesn't drift like normal fog. It breathes, expands, contracts. It moves with the rhythm of something alive. Those who see it don't run. They stand still, transfixed, as though seeing a memory instead of a thing. Some claim the smoke carries shapes inside it. Silhouettes of men hunched beneath invisible packs, walking the same patrol routes they once did. Their forms flicker, dissolve, reform again farther away. Others say it's the land itself, exhaling the dreams of soldiers who never made it home. And maybe that's true, because war leaves no ghosts, only echoes. In the months following the smoke memory investigation, one of the filmmakers, a woman named Layla Rahimi, stayed behind in Asadabad. She began recording the oral histories of villagers who'd lived through decades of conflict. In their stories, she found something that felt both ancient and painfully human. The belief that every act of violence leaves a residue, a kind of invisible ash that clings to the air. One old widow told her, "When men die in anger, the dust remembers. When they die in fear, the air remembers." It wasn't superstition, and it was grief disguised as faith. And as Rahimi wrote in her notes, maybe the smoke isn't what we fear. Maybe it's what fears us, because we made it. She never published her work, but excerpts found later in her journal describe recurring dreams, a field of bones beneath a rising fog, a whisper saying, "You left us here." To understand the myth of the smoke, one has to understand the weight of what soldiers carry home. In the years after Afghanistan, thousands returned haunted, not by the enemy, but by silence. They spoke of insomnia, of hearing voices when the air conditioner hummed, of shadows that lingered too long at the edges of light. Psychologists called it PTSD. But among those who had seen Outpost Razor, it was something else. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. "It's like the smoke followed me home," one veteran wrote on a private forum. "I see it when I close my eyes. It doesn't hurt me. It just waits, like it wants to be remembered." That post received hundreds of replies. Not mockery, not disbelief, only nods, as if every soldier reading it had seen the same thing. In 2025, an international research group on trauma and consciousness released a report titled "Fields of Memory: The Persistence of Emotional Energy in Conflict Zones." Buried deep within it was a paragraph that read, "Electromagnetic recordings in high-casualty battlefields show measurable deviations in energy resonance. These anomalies appear during periods of collective stress and mass death. The data suggests that environments can retain emotional energy long after the human presence is gone. In other words, the earth remembers. The air remembers. The smoke is memory made visible." If that's true, then perhaps the soldiers at Outpost Razor didn't encounter a monster but themselves, reflected back through the grief-soaked fabric of the world. Every heartbeat, every scream, every silent prayer embedded in the dust like data, replaying over and over until someone stops to listen. Maybe the smoke wasn't hunting them. Maybe it was trying to speak. Today, all that remains of the base is a crater of dirt and rusted steel. The mountains have swallowed the roads. The wind has reclaimed the watchtowers, and yet, pilots flying overhead at night still report an odd phenomenon. Sudden drops in temperature, static bursts across comms, and brief flickers of motion in the valley below. No radar signature. No human explanation, just a ripple in the air, moving against the wind. When veterans of that place gather now, in dark bars, in support groups, or alone on porches under flickering lights, they don't talk about firefights or victories. They talk about the silence, about the weight of memory that never leaves. And sometimes when the smoke of a cigarette curls through the night, they see it twist in a way that feels almost familiar, almost alive. They stare at it, and they remember. There's a quote often attributed to a Sufi mystic, carved into the stone of an old shrine near Kunar. "When man forgets his tears, the world must remember them for him." Maybe that's what the smoke is. Not a curse, not a haunting, but the world's way of remembering what we choose to forget. The men who saw it, the soldiers who watched the impossible take shape in the fog, carried home proof of something science still refuses to name. Proof that the human soul leaves fingerprints in the air, proof that the land itself keeps a record of pain, and in that strange, fragile truth there is something both terrifying and beautiful. Because if the world remembers our pain, maybe, just maybe, it remembers our love too. Final reflection. The human echo, the story of the smoke that moves, isn't about ghosts or war. It's about memory, about the things we bury and the ways they resurface, in dreams, in silence, in smoke. Every conflict leaves behind something invisible, and long after the bullets stop, long after the soldiers are gone, something still walks through the dust, carrying their voices, their fears, their names. It isn't supernatural. It's human, and that's what makes it so haunting.